But there's a large issue that almost never gets discussed in the mainstream media. And I think it's a really, really important one, and that is the possibility of human extinction and the certainty, the reality all around us, and the ongoing reality of the extinction of higher order animals, mammals, vertebrates, you know, just the whole thing. As a consequence of both climate change and the fact that we're like 7.6 billion human beings on Earth. There was an editorial published in the journal Science last Friday. The chief scientist of the National Geographic Society, Jonathan Bally, and the chief scientist of the Chinese Academy of Scientists, biologist Yaping Zhang, were the authors of this. And they are explicitly saying, if we want to stop a major extinction crisis, which might include the extinction of the human race, because we do depend upon the natural world for our survival. If we want to stop this major extinction crisis, they say, we need to set aside half of the planet for wild species, wild plants, wild animals, wild everything. The planet's lungs, the planet's kidneys, these are wild areas. And that's not how we're doing it. In fact, this is, I have the editorial here. They start out how much of the planet should we leave for other forms of life, they ask. We're 7.6 billion people now. We're heading for 10 billion. The demands for food and water will more than double by 2050. And then they point out 20% of the world's vertebrates and plants are threatened with extinction. Livestock now constitutes 60% of the biomass, the mammalian biomass on the planet. Livestock, animals being grown to be food for human beings, represents 60% of all mammals on the planet on a mass, on the the percentage of the mass biomass. Humans represent 36%. So as a single species, we're the largest source of protoplasm on the planet. Our feedstock, our animals that we eat, are number 2. And only 4% of the biomass on the planet is represented by the over 5,000 species of wild mammals. Wild vertebrate populations, they say, have declined by more than 50% since 1970. And most scientific studies, and there have been a bunch of them recently that have come out on this, say that to safeguard biodiversity and preserve ecosystem benefits, we have to have between 25 and 75% of our major ecosystems protected, and from human development, human this, human that. But just less than half of the Earth's surface remains relatively intact, and that tends to be much less productive. And only 3.6% of the oceans and 14% of our land are actually explicitly protected. So they're saying that we should convene a conference on biological diversity and do something about this. I'm all in favor of that. I'm very skeptical that anything is going to be done, which concerns me. On the other hand, I had this idea the other day that I think that, I was thinking, okay, what if we were to wipe out the entire human race through global extinction, right? Through climate change and disease or whatever it is. It occurred to me that if this is a somewhat Cartesian view, but I think that it's valid nonetheless, that the intelligence, the intellect that you and I are experiencing right now, the brain, the mind, the thinking processes that we're using, that I'm using to express these ideas, that you're using to understand them and translate them into things meaningful to you, that all of that is the predictable and logical and normal result of a neurological system, a brain, reaching a certain level of complexity. Our brains have a certain level of complexity, and that complexity, and so the question I'm asking is it possible that when any living system reaches that level of complexity, does something like human consciousness just naturally emerge? Because it's a function of the complexity of the system. And does that mean that as we become more complex, as we continue to evolve, And it does appear that the brain complexity is increasing and then humans are evolving. Does that mean that our form of consciousness will change? And is that for the better or for the worse? And does that mean similarly that if humans were wiped out, and let's say that the lizards once again ruled the earth, but they got to be the size of a dinosaur and their brains became as complex as ours, that our consciousness would then become the dinosaur's consciousness? Only they wouldn't be dinosaurs. They would be modern day, you know, whatever you call them. But is it just inevitable? Are we just part of a continuum? For that matter, is the entire universe as a neural system? You know, the planets interact with each other principally through gravity, but also through the other forces, the strong force, the weak force, the electromagnetic force. Is it possible that the entire planet is at already a level of complexity that causes it to be the giant brain of everything, that it is expressing consciousness? And then also the question, if the computer systems of this planet that are increasingly wired to each other by the internet, or if an individual supercomputer were to reach the level of complexity of the human brain, and we're nowhere close to that right now, but if it were, would our kind of consciousness emerge there? And if so, I mean, there's two giant variables that modify our way of understanding consciousness. One is our need to eat. And I suppose for a giant computer, that would be the need for electricity. And the other is our need to reproduce, which drives all kinds of crazy behavior that is constantly getting people in trouble. But these are biological urges that are born into us. Does a computer have the equivalent of that? The desire to seed little viruses all over in other computers all over that could become conscious just like it. I don't know the answer to these questions, but this is the stuff that, you know, sometimes I'm awake at night looking up at the ceiling going, this is the, sorry to inflict it on you.